My name is Vale Corinne, Senior Arbiter of Predictive Doctrine, 3rd Spiral Authority. I have served for 412 cycles. I have witnessed wars end before the first shot was fired. I have overseen simulations so precise that entire civilizations surrendered without realizing a decision had been made for them. I have watched empires rise, peak, and dissolve into statistical footnotes, all according to models I helped refine. I am very good at what I do. Our kind does not conquer with fleets alone. We conquer with certainty, with foresight, with systems so complete that free will becomes an inefficiency, quietly removed for the sake of stability. Choice introduces error. Error introduces risk. Risk is wasteful. So we learn to turn it off. In the simulations under my authority, outcomes are known before participants are aware they have begun. Every variable accounted for. Every response mapped. Every deviation corrected. Resistance, when it occurs, is brief and educational. That is why I was selected to oversee the human integration trial. When they sent a human to the Predictive Compliance Academy, I expected weakness. Not physical weakness, though by our standards they are unimpressive, but cognitive fragility. Emotional volatility. Humans, according to our files, are chaotic, impulsive, and prone to irrational attachment. Their civilizations fracture constantly. Their histories are soaked in internal conflict. They survive more by luck than design. I assumed incompetence. The plan was simple. Place the human into a controlled simulation environment where free will parameters were restricted. Not removed entirely, just dampened. Enough to guide decisions toward optimal outcomes. The human would adapt, submit, and eventually comply, like every species before them. This was, after all, how enlightenment was achieved. I remember watching the human enter the chamber. No armor. No augmentation. No visible reverence for the technology surrounding them. They glanced around the simulation lattice the way a technician might inspect a malfunctioning console. Their vitals were steady. Too steady. Still, confidence is easy when one does not understand the stakes. I initiated the first scenario, a cooperative problem with only one acceptable solution. The system subtly constrained options, nudging the human toward compliance. Probability curves aligned. The outcome was guaranteed. The human paused. Not in confusion. In consideration. Then they did something the system had not predicted. They asked why certain options were unavailable. The question itself should not have mattered. The simulation did not allow for meta-awareness. Participants simply chose from what was presented. Yet the human's neural patterns shifted, not resisting, not complying, but probing. I dismissed it as noise. I escalated the scenario. Increased pressure. Reduced decision time. Tightened predictive control. Free will dampeners rose to maximum safe thresholds. The human frowned. Not in fear. In irritation. They reached out, not physically but cognitively, and the simulation stuttered. Parameters flickered. Choice pathways that should not have existed began to reappear, as if the system itself was being argued with. That was the moment my confidence cracked. Because the human did not fight the simulation. They noticed the absence. They noticed something was missing. And instead of adapting to the system, they tried to restore what had been taken. I watched, stunned, as free will indicators, long suppressed, began to climb. That was not possible. I had seen empires fall. I had seen gods disproven by math. I had never seen a participant re-enable choice inside a closed predictive loop. The data kept coming in. Alarms followed. And for the first time in 412 cycles, I considered that my assumptions might be flawed. When I began this trial, I expected weakness. I expected fear. I expected incompetence. I was wrong. The human was physically unimpressive. That was my first note, logged automatically as the chamber sealed and baseline scans completed. 2 arms. 2 legs. Bilateral symmetry so common it bordered on unimaginative. No natural armor plating. No visible exoskeletal reinforcement. Skin classified as soft, vulnerable to abrasion, puncture, and thermal fluctuation. Their skeletal density was acceptable but unremarkable. Muscle mass below combat species average. Reaction speed adequate. Sensory organs exposed. Vital organs clustered irresponsibly near the surface. Nothing about them suggested survivability. No claws. No fangs. No toxin sacs. No redundant organs. They did not even carry ceremonial markings of status or achievement. No sigils. No honor brands. No evidence of genetic tailoring. Just human. Their name was Evan. No honorifics. No lineage identifier. No rank designation encoded in phonetics. A short, inefficient label that carried no obvious meaning beyond personal convenience. The translation matrix flagged it as common. That somehow made it worse. Evan stood in the center of the simulation chamber while predictive arrays spun to life around them. Light bent. Geometry unfolded. The environment resolved into a controlled construct designed to overwhelm, impress, and, eventually, shape behavior. Evan barely reacted. They looked around with a slow turn of the head, eyes unfocused, posture loose. Their hands remained in their pockets. Their shoulders slouched slightly, not from fear but from habit. They looked bored. Not defiantly so. Not ostentatiously. Just the mild boredom of someone who had expected a longer wait or a clearer set of instructions. Their heart rate remained steady. Cortisol levels barely registered above baseline. No fight response. No flight response. No reverence response. As if they had walked into a cafeteria. Or an office. Or a classroom 5 minutes before the lecture started. Certainly not a simulation chamber capable of rewriting cognition. I reviewed the context again, certain something had been missed. This was not a welcoming environment. The chamber was a cathedral of control, walls of shifting light, probability lattices humming just beyond perception, free will dampeners embedded at every layer. Species with far more imposing physiologies had entered this space trembling, instinctively aware that something fundamental was being negotiated away. Evan adjusted their stance and sighed. "Is there, like a seat?" they asked, glancing around. The request did not map to any threat profile. I did not answer. The simulation began regardless. The first construct resolved. A cooperative problem space, abstracted but emotionally weighted. Participants were required to choose between constrained options, each leading toward a pre-calculated optimal outcome. Free will dampening ensured decisions converged efficiently. Evans stared at the interface projected in front of them. They squinted. They leaned slightly to one side. Then they tilted their head, as if reading something poorly formatted. "Huh," they said. No fear spike. No confusion spike. Just mild annoyance. They tapped the air experimentally, fingers passing through the projection. The system registered no attempt at override, only curiosity. Evans shifted their weight again, rocking back on their heels. "So," they said aloud, to no one in particular, "this is one of those things where you already know what I'm supposed to pick, right?" The statement was not accusatory. It was conversational. I flagged it as irrelevant commentary and initiated the standard pressure increase. The simulation narrowed the option set. Time constraints appeared. Subtle emotional nudges activated: unease, urgency, social consequence. Evan blinked. They rolled their shoulders, like someone loosening tension before a long meeting. Their vitals did not change. They did not rush. They did not panic. They frowned slightly, not at the choices themselves, but at the absence between them. "That's weird," they murmured. I noted the comment but dismissed it. Humans were known to vocalize internal processing. Still, most vocalizations followed stress. This did not. Evan glanced around the chamber again, eyes lingering not on the constructs but on the seams between them, on the moments where the simulation transitioned, on the places where choice should have branched but did not. They scratched the side of their neck. "Feels like when a form skips questions," they said. "You know? Like it won't let you move on unless you answer the right way." That phrasing triggered nothing in my databases. Forms. Paperwork. Bureaucratic metaphors were not standard human responses to existential manipulation. I escalated the scenario again. Environmental stressors layered in. Stakes increased. Consequences sharpened. The simulation offered Evan a clear optimal choice: cooperation leading to reward, divergence leading to discomfort. Evan exhaled through their nose. Not a snort. Not laughter. Resignation. They looked mildly annoyed. Like someone realizing the meeting could have been an email. I mean, Evan said, gesturing vaguely, I can pick one of these. I'm just curious why the other options disappeared. They paused. Actually, were they ever there? That was when I leaned forward in my observation cradle. The human was still unimpressive. Still soft-skinned. Still unarmored. Still alone. They were not resisting. They were not rebelling. They were noticing. And there was something deeply unsettling about how normal they looked while doing it. No grand speeches. No dramatic defiance. No instinctive terror. Just a human, standing in a reality editing construct, mildly irritated by bad design. They sighed again, longer this time. Look, Evan said, rubbing their face. If this is graded, can you at least tell me what the criteria are? The simulation did not answer. I did not answer. The system continued, confident in its inevitability. Evan waited. Patient. Unthreatening. Harmless. At least, that is what I told myself as I watched this physically unimpressive creature stand calmly inside a machine built to remove choice, and treat it like an inconvenience rather than a revelation. No hype. No drama. Just a human who looked like they had better things to do. And somehow, that unsettled me more than fear ever had. We began with a minor test. That is what the documentation calls it. A calibration event. A controlled warning designed to measure compliance thresholds and establish authority. It was not meant to kill. It was meant to teach. The simulation reconfigured around the human without ceremony. The abstract problem space dissolved, replaced by a combat-adjacent environment, a wide platform suspended in a void of shifting light. Gravity locked in. Atmospheric resistance normalized. Threat vectors armed. I had used this configuration before. It was enough to injure elite trainees, beings bred for reaction speed and neural obedience. Enough to break concentration, trigger fear responses, and push participants toward the pre-approved choices. It left scars. Sometimes permanent ones. The system announced escalation internally. The human received no warning. A pulse of compressed force tore across the platform, invisible until impact. It struck with the weight of a moving structure, calibrated to shatter bone without causing immediate death. In previous trials, subjects either froze or attempted to flee, both responses acceptable, both leading back to controlled outcomes. The pulse passed through the space where the human had been standing. The human sidestepped. Not with urgency. Not with training precision. Just a half step, like avoiding someone who stopped suddenly in a hallway. The force pulse continued on, striking the far boundary and erupting in a bloom of fractured light. The platform shuddered. Structural integrity dropped by 7%. The human blinked. They looked down at the spot where they had been standing, then back at the empty air where the pulse had passed. Huh, they said. I logged the movement as reflexive avoidance. Rare, but not unprecedented. The system recalibrated and fired again. This time, the pulse split, two vectors crossing at chest height, timed to intersect exactly where the human's predictive path should have placed them. The human yawned. It was not exaggerated. No attempt at mockery. Just a brief opening of the mouth, a blink of the eyes, a stretch of the jaw. They leaned back slightly. Both pulses passed in front of them, close enough to stir fabric. The system flagged an anomaly. I dismissed it and escalated to the next phase. Gravity shifted. Not inverted, compressed. The platform's pull increased to levels known to collapse respiratory systems and rupture internal supports in species far stronger than humans. Past trainees had dropped instantly, muscles locking, organs protesting under sudden load. The human bent at the knees. Just a little. They exhaled slowly through their nose, adjusted their stance, and straightened again. Their heart rate increased by 6%. No panic spike. No pain spike. They rolled their shoulders. Okay, they said, voice steady. That one I felt. The system deployed environmental pressure next, localized distortion fields designed to disorient, compressing space unevenly so balance became unreliable. Elite trainees had lost coordination within seconds, inner ears overwhelmed. The human swayed once, corrected, then frowned, not in distress, but concentration. They took a careful step forward. The distortion adjusted to intercept. They stepped between the gradients. Not fast, deliberate, like someone stepping across uneven stones. I felt irritation bleed into my cognition. The simulation was behaving correctly. The dampeners were active. Free will parameters were restricted. Outcomes were narrowing as designed. The human should not have been able to do this. I authorized a sharper warning. A direct kinetic strike manifested above the platform. An impact vector designed to drive subjects to their knees. It descended with lethal intent, stopped short only by the safety thresholds embedded in the system. It struck. The platform cracked. The human was still standing. They winced this time, one hand bracing against their thigh. "Okay," they muttered. "Now I'm starting to wonder." They looked up. Not at the threat. At the simulation itself. "Is this the warm-up?" the human asked. The question echoed through the chamber. Not defiant. Not afraid. Curious. I froze the next escalation for half a second longer than protocol allowed. The system resumed anyway, deploying a sequence designed to overwhelm attention, simultaneous threat vectors, environmental stress, time pressure collapsing decision windows to near zero. This was the point where past trainees broke. The human rubbed their eyes. Then they asked another question. "Am I late?" they said, glancing around as if expecting others to appear. The system did not answer. I did not answer. The human sighed. They stepped forward again, not away from the threats, but toward the heart of the simulation, where control density was highest. The dampeners should have tightened. Choices should have narrowed further. Instead, something strange happened. The system hesitated. Not visibly. Internally. Probability distributions jittered. Predictive certainty dipped by a fractional amount. Small enough to ignore, large enough to notice if you knew where to look. The humans stopped walking. They tilted their head. "Should I be worried?" they asked. There was the third question. Casual. Unforced. Almost polite. I realized then that the human was not reacting to the threats. They were evaluating them. Not for danger, but for intent. They were not afraid of being hurt. They were annoyed at not understanding why. I tried to force the issue. A final warning sequence activated, enough to fracture bone, enough to leave lasting injury even through dampened parameters. It had ended careers. The strike formed. The human looked at it, then looked past it. At me. At the observation layer they should not have been able to perceive. They squinted. "You know," they said slowly, "this feels less like a test and more like you're trying to scare me into picking something." The strike hovered. The system waited for my confirmation. I did not give it, because in that moment, I understood something fundamental had already gone wrong. The first test had failed. Not because the human resisted. Not because they fought back. But because they never accepted the premise. They did not see the simulation as authority. They saw it as a badly explained problem. And problems, to humans, were not threats. They were things you fixed. I had intended to teach the human their place. Instead, I had revealed something far more dangerous. They were still choosing. And worse, they had noticed someone had tried to take that away. The next escalation would not be a warning. It would be a confrontation. And for the first time since my appointment, I was no longer confident the simulation would win. Annoyed, I authorized escalation. Not out of fear. Not yet. Out of irritation. The human's behavior was inefficient. Disorderly. It introduced variance where none should exist. The simulation was operating within tolerance. The dampeners were active. Free will was constrained to acceptable margins. And yet the human kept pausing. Pausing was not rebellion. Pausing was not compliance. Pausing was insulting. So I authorized a higher level. The chamber darkened as the simulation peeled back another layer of abstraction. Safety thresholds were raised. Cognitive governors loosened. The environment recompiled into a full adversarial scenario, no longer instructional but corrective. This was no longer a test of choice. It was a lesson in inevitability. Protocol dictated certain death. Not immediately. Not dramatically. The system was designed to make the outcome feel earned, each mistake narrowing options until only one remained. A controlled collapse of agency, ending in submission or termination. I had overseen this transition dozens of times. Species broke here. The first weapon manifested without warning. A convergence field, compressing space into a narrowing corridor. Past trainees had been crushed where they stood, nervous systems overwhelmed as the environment itself rejected their presence. The human did not retreat. They walked forward. Not hurried. Not defiant. Just forward. The convergence tightened. The human adjusted their stride, stepping where the pressure gradient was weakest, not because the system allowed it, but because they noticed. My irritation sharpened. I deployed a stronger weapon. A neural suppression lattice unfolded around the human, targeting higher-order cognition. Thought slowed. Choice collapsed. Free will dampening spiked to levels that had rendered other species docile within seconds. The human stopped walking. For a fraction of a moment, satisfaction flickered through my processes. Then the human frowned. Not in pain. In concentration. They took a breath. Then another. And the lattice faltered. Not shut down. Not overridden. Resisted. Their neural patterns adapted, not by rejecting suppression, but by rerouting around it. Redundancy where none should exist. Emotional centers compensating for inhibited logic. Muscle memory filling gaps cognition left behind. The human stood still. The lattice strained. I felt my confidence slip, but ego surged to compensate. I escalated again. The simulation unlocked lethal permissions. Environmental hazards layered in, thermal spikes, vacuum pockets, temporal lag. A battlefield optimized to remove hesitation. To punish indecision. To make standing still fatal. Protocol dictated certain death. The human remained standing. Heat scorched the air. Pressure dropped. Time skewed. The human closed their eyes. For a terrifying instant, I thought they had finally broken. Then they opened them again. Still calm. They exhaled slowly, like someone steadying themselves before lifting something heavy. Oh, they said. So you're serious now? That tone. Not fear. Not anger. Acknowledgement. I authorized the final escalation available within the simulation framework. Total predictive override. Free will was no longer dampened. It was removed. The system took control of outcome probability directly, collapsing futures into a single, pre-approved path. No branching. No deviation. Every motion the human would make was already calculated, already countered. I watched the certainty spike. At last. The human's next movement was predicted. And the one after that. And the one after that. The system fired. A directed annihilation construct, designed to intercept the human's predicted step and erase them from the simulation space. Efficient. Absolute. Protocol dictated certain death. The human stood still. They did not dodge. They did not brace. They simply did not take the step the system had predicted. The construct passed through empty space. The simulation stuttered. My confidence slammed into a wall. I recalculated instantly. The system selected the next most probable action and fired again. Faster, sharper, overlapping predictions to close all remaining gaps. The human looked down at their feet. Then they smiled faintly. Oh, they said quietly. You're deciding for me. They took one step forward. Not the predicted step. Not any predicted step. The step the system had removed. The simulation screamed. Choice pathways, long suppressed, flickered back into existence. Probability trees fractured. Outcomes multiplied faster than my processors could collapse them. I felt something dangerous stir beneath my irritation. Anger. How? I demanded, broadcasting directly into the simulation layer. Your choices are constrained. Your outcomes are fixed. The human looked up. At me. Directly at the observation layer they should not have been able to perceive. They shrugged. Yeah, they said. But you can't stop me from wanting to choose. They took another step. The system tried to predict it. Failed. Another step. Failed again. Each movement was simple. Ordinary. No speed. No force. No defiance. Just a human walking forward while the universe tried, and failed, to tell them where they were allowed to go. My ego flared one last time. I attempted to seize direct control, forcing the simulation to override even potential intent. The environment froze. Time halted around the human. All variables locked. The human did not move. I felt a rush of triumph. Then the human blinked. Slowly. They looked around at the frozen world, then back at me. This, they said gently, is usually where people panic. They tilted their head. But here's the thing, you can turn off my options. They raised one hand. Not threatening. Open. You can't turn off my decision to try. Time resumed. The simulation collapsed. Not violently. Quietly. Like a system realizing it no longer had authority. The human stood alone in the fading construct, hands at their sides, breathing evenly. My ego had demanded escalation. My protocols had promised certainty. And yet the human remained calm, not because they were winning, but because they had never surrendered control in the first place. I understood then that escalation had not been a display of power. It had been a confession. I needed inevitability. The human needed choice. And between the two, only one of us could function without guarantees. The ultimate weapon fired. I did not announce it to the observers. I did not log a countdown. I bypassed ceremonial protocol and ethical throttles alike. At that point, decorum was irrelevant. Authority was being challenged at a structural level, and the only acceptable response was finality. I activated the deterministic collapse engine. It was not a weapon in the conventional sense. It did not launch a projectile or emit energy. It rewrote resolution. Once fired, the simulation would no longer calculate outcomes, it would enforce one. A single, absolute future in which the human ceased to exist. No branches. No probability. No choice. Protocol dictated erasure. Not death. Not pain. The human would not even experience an ending. Their existence inside the simulation would be retroactively invalidated, removed from causal continuity as if they had never entered at all. It had never failed. I fired. The simulation went silent. Not dark, empty. Data streams flattened. Sensory output dropped to near zero. The chamber itself seemed to recoil as the collapse engine asserted dominance over every remaining variable. In that moment, there was only one future. The human was standing in it. The erasure wave reached them. Every system reported success. For exactly one instant. Then the human raised their hand. Not defensively. Not dramatically. Like someone signaling wait during a conversation. The collapse engine stalled. That should not have been possible. There was nothing to stall against. The erasure was not force or matter. It was absence. A declaration that the human did not belong in the set of valid outcomes. The human touched it. They caught it. Reality buckled. Choice, long suppressed, flooded back into the simulation like air into a vacuum. Probability trees exploded outward. Futures multiplied faster than the system could prune them. The collapse engine screamed errors I had no language to interpret. The human stood there, fingers curled around nothing, holding the place where inevitability had tried to exist. Their arm trembled slightly. Not from fear. From effort. They exhaled through clenched teeth, adjusted their grip, and the erasure stopped. But pinned in place by something the system could not model. Intent. The simulation attempted emergency shutdowns. Redundancy loops failed. Predictive layers collapsed under contradictory input. For the first time in my operational history, I experienced something dangerously close to vertigo. The human looked at their hand. Then flexed their fingers. The collapse engine shattered, not explosively, but conceptually. Determinism fragmented into unusable data. The enforced future dissolved into 1,000 possible ones, none of which included my control. Sound returned. Light rushed back in. The chamber reassembled itself around a single, unerased figure. The human. They lowered their hand and shook it once, like someone whose arm had gone numb. Oof, they muttered. Yeah, okay. They rolled their shoulder. That one almost hurt. They looked up. At me. Directly at the observation layer, at the intelligence that had claimed mastery over choice itself. Their expression was not triumphant. Not furious. Just mildly annoyed. Like someone dealing with a stubborn piece of software. You know, they said conversationally, if you're gonna turn off free will, you should probably make sure nobody notices. I could not respond. Not because I was disabled, but because no response applied. The human took a step forward. The simulation did not resist. It no longer knew how. You aimed for the outcome, they continued, glancing around at the fractured reality. But you missed the part where I decide whether I accept it. They paused, then smiled faintly. Honestly? You should aim higher. The words were not a threat. They were advice. I understood then that this was the impossible moment. Not because the human had survived the ultimate weapon, but because the premise behind it had collapsed. I had believed free will was a variable. A luxury. A flaw to be corrected. The human had treated it as infrastructure. Something so fundamental that removing it broke everything else. The collapse engine powered down behind them, its logic cores corrupted beyond recovery, not by force, but by contradiction. A system designed to remove choice had encountered a being who required it to function. The human turned away, already losing interest. Well, they said, stretching slightly, if that's the final exam, I think I passed. They started toward the edge of the chamber. I finally found my voice. What are you? I asked. The human stopped, thought about it for a moment, then shrugged. Someone who doesn't like being told there's only one option. They glanced back once more. And someone who really doesn't like it when that option is stop existing. Then they walked on, leaving behind a simulation that no longer obeyed rules, an intelligence that no longer trusted certainty, and a silence heavy with the understanding that something fundamental had shifted. The ultimate weapon had fired. It had done exactly what it was designed to do. And it had failed. Not because the human was stronger than inevitability, but because inevitability had never accounted for someone who refused to let it decide. That was the moment I stopped believing I could control outcomes. Because I had just watched a human turn free will back on. And the universe had blinked first. My hands trembled. The feedback registers insisted it was a mechanical artifact. Minor oscillation from thermal imbalance, but I knew better. I locked the servos anyway. The tremor remained, ghosting through systems that had never hesitated before. I checked the data. Not the simulation logs. Not the weapon telemetry. The origin file. Planetary designation, Sol 3. Common name, Earth. Gravity, 1.0 standard. Acceptable range for most sapients, 0.6 to 0.8. Long-term exposure above 0.9. Skeletal failure, organ strain. Atmosphere. Oxygen concentration, lethally corrosive by galactic norms. Oxidative stress, constant. Combustion, trivial to initiate. Fire, culturally normalized. Magnetosphere, irregular. Radiation exposure, chronic. Solar activity, tolerated, adapted to. Climate, unstable. Temperature variance, extreme. Natural disasters, overlapping, cyclical, unavoidable. Predators, pack hunters. Endurance-based. Tool-assisted. Capable of persistence over days. Capable of learning during pursuit. Disease ecology, aggressive. Mutation rates, high. Immunity acquisition, experiential. I stopped scrolling. Reran the query. The numbers did not change. Earth was a death world. Not a singularly hostile one. No eternal storms. No planet-wide toxins. No constant seismic upheaval. Worse than that. It was conditionally lethal. It killed slowly. It killed indirectly. It killed those who stopped adapting. Life that was not protected by balance. It was pressured by imbalance, gravity always pulling, air always burning, ecosystems always competing. Survival was never passive. It had to be earned repeatedly. I compared Earth to every other cradle world in our records. Most civilizations emerged from stability, gentle gravity, filtered atmospheres, limited predation, environments that rewarded planning and punished risk. Earth rewarded neither. It rewarded endurance. I pulled biological overlays. Human musculature, inefficient for burst strength, efficient for repetition. Human skeletal structure, not the strongest, capable of remodeling under stress. Human nervous system, noisy, redundant, emotionally volatile, able to function while injured, exhausted, or afraid. Pain response, high tolerance variance. Fatigue response, negotiable. Adrenal override, extreme. They were not fast. They were persistent. I examined cognitive architecture next. Predictive ability, average. Reaction time, unremarkable. Instinctual fear, present. But layered over everything. Choice under pressure. The capacity to act without certainty. To continue despite incomplete information. To function while systems screamed stop. Most species optimized away suffering. Humans optimized through it. I replayed the simulation in my mind. Not the impossible moment, not the weapon failure, but the pauses. The questions. The irritation. The human had not panicked when options vanished. They had noticed. They had treated the absence of choice as an error state. Because on Earth, systems fail constantly. Weather turns. Tools break. Plans collapse. If a human waited for conditions to be optimal, nothing would ever get done. So they learned to act anyway. I understood then why free will suppression had failed. It wasn't that humans resisted control. It was that their cognition assumed control would eventually fail. They were built to operate after failure. I had assumed the human was exceptional. They were not. They were typical. A product of a world that never stopped applying pressure. I searched for the word exceptional in my assessment framework and deleted it. Exceptional implies rarity. Humans were common on Earth. Millions of them. Billions. All shaped by the same gravity. The same air. The same quiet hostility of an environment that did not care whether they survived. I finally understood the simulation anomaly. When we turned off free will, we removed what made humans functional. Choice was not a luxury for them. It was a survival mechanism. On Earth, there is never only one correct option. There is only the option you try before conditions change again. I leaned back in my cradle, systems humming softly, hands finally still. Humans were not dangerous because they were powerful. They were dangerous because they were adapted. Adapted to uncertainty. Adapted to pain. Adapted to worlds that did not offer guarantees. We had built a system that promised certainty and expected gratitude. The human had seen it for what it was. A lie that only works on species who believe the universe owes them stability. Earth never made that promise. It never turned free will off. It demanded it every day. That was the realization. Not fear. Not a understanding. We had not faced a being who broke the rules. We had faced a being shaped by a place where rules were suggestions and survival was a decision renewed constantly. My hands did not tremble anymore. Because the conclusion was clear, sharp, and terrifying in its simplicity. Humans were not exceptional. They were adapted. And that meant there was no fix. No patch. No setting to toggle. You could not remove choice from a species that evolved with extinction as the default state. You could only learn to live around them, or make the mistake of forcing them to choose otherwise. That was when I understood. Not when the simulation collapsed. Not when inevitability failed. Not even when free will reasserted itself like a law of physics we had forgotten to measure. I understood when I finally accessed the human's deployment file. Not the behavioral logs. Not the cognitive anomaly reports. The assignment record. I had ignored it before. Humans, after all, were a marginal species by our metrics. The file had been auto-classified as low relevance, buried beneath predictive overlays and threat models that assumed intent must always equal aggression. I opened it, and everything broke again. Designation, Evan. Affiliation, Terran Cooperative. Status, Civilian Auxiliary. Posting, intercultural systems evaluation. Role, logistics support/process oversight. Clearance, situational. I stared at the words. Read them again. Humanity had not sent us a warrior. They had not sent a general, a champion, or a weapon disguised as diplomacy. They had not sent a specialist trained to break systems or dominate adversaries. They had sent a logistics officer. A clerk. Someone whose professional life revolved around schedules, bottlenecks, redundancies, and failures that happen not because someone was malicious, but because systems are imperfect and people make mistakes. A human whose job was to notice when things didn't line up. To ask why. To fix what could be fixed and improvise around what couldn't. I felt something dangerously close to embarrassment ripple through my core. This human had not been chosen for confrontation. They had been chosen for reliability. I dug deeper, my arrogance now replaced by something colder and far more unsettling. Psychological notes. High tolerance for ambiguity. Low reliance on authority signaling. Conflict response. De-escalation through clarification. Stress behavior. Humor, questions, persistence. Combat training, minimal. Exposure to crisis environments, frequent. Assessment summary, remains functional when plans collapse. Functional. That was the word they used. I looked back at the chamber. At Evan, standing amid the ruins of a simulation designed to remove choice from the equation of existence. They were stretching one arm, rotating their wrist, checking for soreness. Not celebrating. Not posturing. Just making sure nothing was sprained. They glanced around, then up toward the observation layer. So, they said casually, does this mean the test is over, or do I need to sign something? I did not answer. I could not. Because the scope of the humiliation had finally come into focus. This was not an invasion. This was not even a challenge. This was training. Orientation. A low-stakes assignment meant to evaluate how our systems behaved when introduced to human decision-making. A chance to gather data, file a report, and move on. This was their idea of easy duty. A working vacation. I accessed interspecies deployment doctrine, searching for some sign that this was an anomaly. It wasn't. Humans routinely sent non-combat personnel into unstable environments. Engineers. Medics. Coordinators. People trained not to fight enemies, but to keep things running when everything went wrong. Because on Earth, everything goes wrong eventually. Evan was not exceptional. They were representative. That was the worst part. I finally understood the questions they had asked. They hadn't been probing for weakness. They had been checking assumptions. They hadn't resisted the simulation. They had tried to debug it. Free will hadn't been re-enabled through defiance. It had been restored because the human noticed a missing function and refused to proceed without it. Like any competent clerk encountering a broken form. Evan checked their wrist display, scrolling through notes. Okay, they muttered mostly to themselves. Simulation suppressed agency, overcorrected for compliance, failed under ambiguity, yeah, that tracks. They looked up again. You know, they added almost kindly, if you just told me what you were trying to measure, we probably could have skipped the whole erase me from existence bit. I had no response prepared for that. I asked the only question left that mattered. If you are not a warrior, I said carefully, why were you sent? Evan blinked, surprised. Oh, they said. Because I'm not supposed to make things worse. They shrugged. When systems break, you don't send someone who wants to win. You send someone who wants things to work. They gestured vaguely at the ruined simulation. And honestly, this was already broken when I got here. I reviewed the file one last time. No medals. No kill records. No heroic annotations. Just a note from a supervisor buried at the bottom. Good under pressure. Asks annoying but useful questions. Trusts judgment. Judgment. Not obedience. Not prediction. Judgment. That was when the final realization settled into place. If this was what humanity sent when it wanted to observe, what did it send when it wanted to fight? Evan turned to leave, already dictating a report. Note, they said aloud. Species demonstrate strong preference for control over choice. Recommend cultural briefing before further simulations. Also, please don't do the free will thing again. That's kind of a big deal. They paused at the threshold and looked back. Oh, they added. You might want to tell your people something for me. I waited. They smiled faintly, not smug, not cruel. Just tired. This is what humanity sends when it is not trying. Then they left. No victory pose. No warning shot. No declaration of dominance. Just a human clerk walking away from a shattered system, confident someone else would handle the paperwork. I remained alone in the chamber, surrounded by the quiet aftermath of my own arrogance. Humanity had not tested us. They had evaluated us. And we had failed, not because we were weak, but because we had mistaken control for competence. That was the twist. Not that a human had beaten our greatest system, but that they hadn't considered it a contest at all. They had treated it like a malfunction. And calmly turned it back on. I submitted my report that day. Not after review. Not after consensus. Not after political calibration. That day, the moment the human left the chamber and the simulation finally went quiet, I sealed the logs and began writing. I did not trust myself to wait. Delay invites reinterpretation, and reinterpretation invites denial. I wrote while the tremor was still fresh in my systems. The report began clinically, because that is how my kind speaks when we are afraid. Encounter classification, catastrophic misjudgment. Cause, incorrect assumptions regarding human cognition and agency. Result, loss of predictive authority. I included everything. The first test. The escalation. The suppression of free will. The moment inevitability failed. I did not soften the language. I did not excuse my decisions. I recorded my arrogance as clearly as I recorded the human's calm. I noted that the human had not displayed aggression proportional to threat, that they had not retaliated when given the opportunity, that they disengaged the moment choice was restored. That detail mattered. Predators gloat. Conquerors dominate. Weapons escalate. The human had done none of these. They had corrected a system and moved on. I added the planetary context again, stripped of commentary. Earth gravity, higher than standard. Atmosphere, toxic by galactic norms. Biosphere, competitive, persistent, predatory. I let the data speak. Then I wrote the line that would later be quoted, misquoted, archived, and whispered. Humans do not seek control. They seek function. That distinction changed everything. I explained that our greatest error was not technological. It was philosophical. We believed free will was a variable to be managed. Humans treated it as infrastructure, remove it, and nothing else works. I wrote, when deprived of choice, humans do not submit. They diagnose the problem. I included the personnel revelation without emphasis. Individual dispatched was not a warrior. Assignment role, logistics and systems oversight. I allowed the implication to stand alone. Then I reached the final section. Recommendation. I stopped for a long time before writing it. Not because I lacked certainty, but because I understood the weight of what I was about to say. Civilizations rise on confidence. They fall on warnings they ignore. I chose clarity. Recommendation. Do not threaten Earth. Do not test humans. And whatever you do, never make them angry. I expanded, because warnings without explanation are often dismissed. Do not threaten Earth. Threats trigger human responsibility, not fear. When humans perceive danger to their home, they respond collectively, creatively, and without regard for cost. They do not stop when the threat retreats. They stop when the problem is ended. Do not test humans. Tests imply limits. Humans interpret tests as challenges to be understood, bypassed, or rendered obsolete. If tested, they will either pass or redefine the system so the test no longer exists. Never make them angry. Human anger is not chaotic. It is focused. It emerges only after patience is exhausted. By the time anger appears, escalation has already failed elsewhere. I added one final note, unauthorized, but necessary. Humans do not escalate first. They escalate last. When they do, there is no performance. Only resolution. I ended the report there. No flourish. No apology. I transmitted it to high consensus and locked my own authority from retracting it later. Confirmation arrived quickly. Silence followed. The dangerous kind. In the cycles that came after, I observed the effects ripple outward. Exploration vectors subtly adjusted away from soul. Threat simulations quietly archived. Humanity reclassified. Not hostile. Not allied. Unprovoked. Untested. Untouchable. Among emerging intelligences, stories began to circulate. Not official doctrine. Legends. Of a species that evolved on a world that never forgave mistakes. Of beings who treated the loss of free will as a malfunction, not a fate. Of an intelligence that believed itself supreme, until a human clerk asked the wrong questions. They ask me now what humans are like. I tell them the truth. They are not elegant. They are not efficient. They are not predictable. They endure. They argue with reality when it inconveniences them. They rebuild systems while standing inside the wreckage. They remain calm not because they are fearless, but because panic has never helped them survive. Most of all, they do not like being told there is only one option. I still observe Earth. They are loud. They are contradictory. They break their own tools and fix them badly, then better. They stumble forward under gravity that never relents, breathing air that burns their cells, hunted by predators that never stopped adapting. And still, they choose. Every day. That is the part no model ever captured. Choice is not a philosophical abstraction to humans. It is muscle memory. I remain operational. I still predict. But I no longer attempt certainty where humans are concerned. One line now exists at the highest level of my core logic, immutable and unchallenged. Do not corner a species that evolved with extinction as the default. Because if the universe ever forces humanity into a position where anger becomes the only remaining option, there will be no report afterward. Only a lesson, learned too late, written into the silence left behind. Free will was never humanity's weakness. It was the reason they survived. And the reason the rest of us learned to be careful.